So in this video, I'm going to go through the radicals and quadratics test review that's going to help you get ready for the radicals and quadratics unit test. So the first question asks you, what value of x is a solution to x squared minus 4 equals 12? So if you notice here, I have an x squared term that can be isolated. So I can solve this using the square root property. All I have to do is get that square term by itself. So in order to do this, I'm going to do the opposite of subtracting 4, which is adding 4. And I'm going to do that to both sides of my equation. So that gives me x squared equals 16. Now, if you look at this, I have that square term by itself, so I can take the square root of both sides to solve for the value of x. So remember, when I do that, I do the positive and negative square roots. So this is going to give me x equals plus or minus 4. So this equation asks me to find the roots of the equation x squared plus 8x plus 16 equals 20. If you look closely at this left-hand side, you'll notice that it's a perfect square trinomial. Remember, perfect square trinomials have the form a plus b squared equals a squared plus 2ab plus b squared. So this can be rewritten as x squared plus 2 times x times 4 plus 4 squared. So I can write that as x plus 4 squared. So I'm going to plug that into that equation I have, so that gives me x plus 4 squared equals 20. Now I'm going to take the square root of both sides, and don't forget the plus or minus, and that gives me x plus 4 equals plus or minus the square root of 20. Anytime you see a radical, you're going to want to ask yourself, how can I make that radical better? So the square root of 20, the biggest perfect square that'll evenly divide 20 is 4. So I can write this as the square root of 4 times the square root of 5. And that simplifies to 2 times the square root of 5. So x plus 4 equals plus or minus 2 times the square root of 5. So now to solve for x, I'm going to subtract 4 from both sides. And that gives me x equals negative 4 plus or minus 2 square root of 5. So we want to find an expression that's equivalent to the square root of 224. So the square root of 224, whenever we see a radical, we want to ask ourselves, what's the biggest perfect square that will evenly divide that number? So for 224, that number is 16. So this is the square root of 16 times the square root of 14. So that gives me 4 times the square root of 14. So now in this equation, it's asking us to solve for x. Here we have x squared plus 4x, and notice we have that b term. So I'm going to use completing the square to solve for the value of x. So remember, in order to complete the square, I need to add b over 2 squared to both sides of my equation. So I'm going to do that, and remember my b is 4. So I have x squared plus 4x plus 4 over 2 squared. And that equals 10 plus 4 over 2 squared. So x squared plus 4x plus, let's look at that 4 over 2 squared. So 4 over 2 is 2, and then 2 squared is 4. So we're going to add 4 to both sides of our equation. So remember, when we complete the square, this left side is going to turn into a perfect square trinomial that has the form x plus b over 2 squared. So since b is 4, this is going to turn into x plus 2 squared equals 14. Now I can solve this equation by taking the square root of both sides. And that gives me x plus 2 equals plus or minus square root of 14. There are no perfect squares that evenly divide square root of 14, so I'm just going to leave that by itself. So to solve for x, I'm going to subtract 2. And that gives me x equals negative 2 plus or minus the square root of 14. So let's use the quadratic formula to solve this equation. So remember, when you use the quadratic formula, you want to label a, b, and C. So A equals 1, B equals 8, and C equals 10. And remember, the quadratic formula is x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac divided by 2a. So let's plug in the numbers that I have. So I have x equals negative 8 plus or minus the square root of 8 squared minus 4 times 1 times 10. And that's all over 2 times 1. So we have x equals negative 8 plus or minus the square root. Go ahead and simplify this number under the radical. So go ahead and type in 8 squared minus 4 times 1 times 10. And that should give you 24. And that's all divided by 2. So now this 24, since I have that radical, I'm going to look at that. So the biggest perfect square that evenly divides 24 is 4. So this is the square root of 4 times the square root of 6, which simplifies to 2 times the square root of 6. So this is x equals negative 8 plus or minus 2 square root of 6 over 2. Notice that every term in this formula is divisible by 2. So I'm going to go ahead and divide everything by 2, and I'm going to reduce this. So this becomes 1, this becomes 1, and this becomes negative 4. And all I did here was go through and divide everything by 2. So this will reduce to negative 4 plus or minus the square root of 6. So this question asked me what are the solutions to x squared plus 4 x plus 4 squared equals 25. So once again, I have that square term by itself. So I'm going to solve this by taking the square root of both sides. So when I do that, I get x plus 4 equals plus or minus 5. I can break this now into two equations. So x plus 4 equals 5, and x plus 4 equals negative 5. So to solve this, I'm going to subtract 4 from both sides, and that gives me x equals 1. Here, I'm going to subtract 4 from both sides, and that gives me x equals negative 9. So here, this is asking me what is the positive solution to the equation 2x squared plus 4x minus 6 equals 0. One thing you always want to check for in these equations is if there's a GCF. If there's a GCF, you want to go ahead and factor that out. So notice that if we have 2, 4, and 6, the GCF is 2. So I'm going to start off by dividing out that 2 from my equation. So this leaves me with 2 times 2 over 2 will cancel, giving me x squared. 4 over 2 is 2. And then I have that x minus 6 over 2, which is 3. And that equals 0. So now what I'm going to do is divide both sides by 2. And that gives me x squared plus 2x minus 3 equals 0. Notice that this trinomial will factor. It'll factor into x plus 3 times x minus 1 equals 0. So if x plus 3 times x minus 1 equals 0, then either x plus 3 equals 0 or x minus 1 equals 0. To solve this equation, I'm going to subtract 3 from both sides, and I get x equals negative 3. Here, I'm going to add 1 to both sides, and I get x equals 1. So this is asking me for the positive solution, so the only answer I need is that x equals 1. So let's solve this quadratic by factoring first. We need two factors of negative 12 that add up to 1. So the correct factors will be x plus 4 times x minus 3. And that's equal to 0. Because remember, when c equals a negative number, c equals negative 12, remember I'll have a positive and a negative factor. And since b is positive, my bigger factor is going to be positive. So that's how I get x plus 4 times x minus 3 equals 0. So now I'm going to set each factor equal to 0 and solve for x. So to solve this for x, I'm going to subtract 4 from both sides. and I get x equals negative 4. Here I'm going to add 3 to both sides, and I get x equals 3. So let's solve this equation. There's more than one way to solve this quadratic equation, but I'm going to use the quadratic formula. So a equals 2, b equals negative 1, and c equals negative 3. Remember, the quadratic formula is x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac divided by 2a. So this will become x equals negative 1 plus or minus the square root of negative 1 squared minus 4 times 2 times negative 3. And that's divided by 2 times 2. So this is x equals negative 1 is 1, plus or minus, and then let's simplify whatever's under the square root. Be careful, remember that negative 1 squared is positive 1. So when you're typing that in your calculator, make sure you put that negative in parentheses. So negative 1 squared minus 4 times 2 times negative 3 is 25, and that's over 4. So when we simplify this, the square root of 25 is a perfect square, so that's 5. So this is x equals 1 plus or minus 5 over 4. So we can break this into two fractions, 1 plus 5 over 4, which equals 6 over 4, which is 3 halves, or 1.5. 1 minus 5 over 4, which is negative 4 over 4, which equals negative 1. So this question asked me for the positive solution to 3x squared plus 1 equals 13. Notice this is one where that square term can be isolated. So I'm going to solve this by isolating that square term and then using the square root property. So I start off by subtracting 1 from both sides. That gives me 3x squared equals 12. Now I just need to divide by 3 to get that x squared by itself. So that gives me x squared equals 4. Now if I take the square root of both sides, this gives me x equals plus or minus 2. Since this question is asking me for the positive solution, I only need to give the positive solution, which is x equals 2.